Hello, dear listeners. Thank you for joining us on the second episode of our new program series, Policy Formulation and Economic Development on Amorgate Radio Communication. I am your host, Titilola Ogunshono. Today's episode promises to be another expository and interesting one. Last week, on the maiden edition, I mentioned that we cannot talk about economic development without mentioning and understanding the rudiments and peculiarities of economic growth. We established the definition of economic growth as a monetary value of final, not intermediate, final goods and services produced in a particular country or a nation, within a given period of time, usually a year. So most times you see figures like, GDP, economic growth of the US for 2023, 2022 is usually mentioned or measured at the end of a year. We also looked at the commonly used measure of economic growth, which is the gross domestic product, and the acronym widely called the GDP. We did an interesting comparison between the GDP of a continent, that is Africa, versus the GDP of a country of that of the USA. And realized that in 2023, the GDP of Africa as a continent was 3.1 trillion US dollars, while that of the US, a country, was 27.36 trillion US dollars. We went further to do another comparison between a country, that's Nigeria, and some states in the US. The GDP of Nigeria as a country for last year was 1.16 trillion US dollars, while that of California was about 38.1 trillion US dollars. That of Texas was about 2.56 US dollars, and that of New York was about 2.15 trillion US dollars. You can say it again, that's huge disparity, between the country of Nigeria and the state in the US. For today, we'll be unraveling the concept of economic development. We'll be looking at the various ideas by different scholars and authorities in the field of economics on the concept of economic development. We'll be answering this pertinent question: why do we have economic growth in countries and still adding lead to development in them? Let us look at the concept of economic development. Economic development is a sustainable increase in the total output of all goods and services produced in a country, accompanied by desirable social and institutional change. Looking closely at this definition, you see that the former part of the definition speaks to the concept of economic growth. That is, the quantity of goods and services that have been produced in a country or nation at a particular point in time. But the latter part speaks to the concept of development. It's saying that it must be accompanied. If we have produced 10 trillion USD worth of goods, it must be accompanied by social and institutional change. That is where development comes in. It should be accompanied by improvement in infrastructure like education, communication, technology, legal, health, transportation, but to mention a few. Also, social, political, and institutional factors that are necessary to facilitate the transformation of the economy. In the same vein, a renowned economics Gigant opinionated that when you talk about economic development, it is viewed as a qualitative change in economic wants, goods, incentives, institutions, productivity, and knowledge. And you can also say that an upward system of the entire social system. So looking at this, it's clear that even Gigant has that position. When we talk about economic development, it speaks to the quality of life of the people. It speaks to how sustainable your social systems are in a nation, not just the numerical value of goods and services produced in that nation. Now, I love this definition of economic development the most, and that is by the father of economics development, the person of Todaro. In 2008, he defined economic development as a sustained elevation of an entire society and social system towards a better or more humane life. And that is very comprehensive. It's saying that the totality of a society, the social system must be geared towards making the life of its citizen better off. That is where true development takes place. So according to him, there are three core values of development. When you are talking about economic development in any nation, you are going to be looking at three core values. So you keep asking yourself, as a country, as a nation, do you have one? The second, what is the value inherent in your economic system, in your social system? The first value, according to Totaro, is life sustenance. That is, you must ensure that every citizen has the basic necessities of life. And the basic necessities of life, we're talking about food, clothes, and shelter. And of course, for management experts, you remember Maslow hierarchy of needs. That's the basic need according to the pyramid of needs proponent by Maslow. So everybody, every citizen must be able to afford to eat good food. They must have a roof over their head. You don't want to have anyone homeless, and they must wear not very expensive but affordable, decent clothes. So that is the basic life sustenance. That is one of the core values of development according to Totaro. So if you are experiencing economic growth as a nation, the first thing you want to check yourself with is, does everyone in your country have access to good food? Can they clothe themselves? And do they have decent accommodation? Not expensive, not living in a castle or a mansion, but basic needs of life. The second value is self-esteem. This deals with a sense of self-worth and respect. This implies that no one can be used as a tool by others for their own needs. Now the question is, do you have every citizen in your country having that level, that worth of self-esteem? Unfortunately, from experience and empirical research that has been taken from data collected that I've done, is that one factor inhibiting people from having what they call self-esteem for trading their way is poverty. When people are poor, they cannot feed, they cannot get a roof over their head, they cannot, have access to quality education for their children. Self-esteem becomes missing in their dictionary of life. The third value is freedom to choose, or freedom from servitude. This implies an increase in the range of choices of your citizens, not being bound by archaic or barbaric cultural practices, traditions, misery, institutions, or even dogmatic beliefs. When people are free from it, you allow people to choose what they believe in, you allow people to go, be themselves, express themselves, then you are talking about economic development. According to Totaro, these are the three core values of economic development. So you should ask yourself, whatever country that you are in, do you have these values in your country? Is everyone there having that self-worth, self-esteem? Are people free to choose? They have freedom from barbaric, archaic cultural practices? And do they have basic life sustenance, goals? Food, shelter, clothing. I know what could be going through the mind of some of our listeners is, are you saying we should have freedom without limits, without barriers? Okay, I agree with you. In reality, we can't have freedom without limits, without barriers. That's why we have laws. However, but it has to do with the drive to minimize external constraints in the pursuit of social development. Yes, there must be barriers, there must be limits, but you must not kill people's initiative. It must not be done to kill the level of creativity. It must not be done to trample on the level of self-worth and self-esteem. Okay, yes, we're taking economic development, definition from various scholars of economics, renowned authorities in economics. Now, in summary, what is economic development to the layman? Is the process of satisfying the basic needs of the people in a country, raising their self-esteem and alignment, and endowing them with the capacity to sustain their achievements. So yes, you allow them, take care of their feeding, they can afford clothing, they can afford housing. Also, you are also raising their self-esteem to be self-reliant, and you're also looking at sustainability for them. So if you find a particular workforce from 20 to 30 years being sustainable, and when they are in their 50s is not sustainable, that is not sustainable development. If you're just joining us, thank you so much for that. The program is Policy Formulation and Economic Development, and we'll be unraveling the concept of economic development so far. So let's look at the criteria of the check for development. The first point I'm going to mention is that development must be people-oriented. Remember, it's not just about the quantity of goods and services that you have produced, it's more about the people, the standard of living of your people. Every program that you're going to put in place must be tailored towards making your people in your country sustainable, making their life better off, making them discover themselves, making them get to the peak of their career, discovering and achieving a lot as individuals. Remember, it's about the people. So you are looking at the literacy rate among your people. Various studies have discovered that we have positive relationship between literacy rates and wealth. That is, the more educated your people are, the higher the possibility of them being comfortable, being wealthy. So it means that there exists an inverse, or what we say, negative relationship between literacy rate and poverty. That is, the more literate your people are, the lower the level of poverty that would exist among your communities in your country. I try to look at countries around the world and discover countries that have gotten it right in terms of their literacy rate. And I discovered Andorra. It has almost 100% of its people being literate. Andorra is a part of the southwestern Europe, and the strategy I realized that the government of Andorra deployed is that they directed every child aged between 6 and 16 submit to compulsory attendance within the school system. So imagine that kind of strategy that has been deployed by the government. So it means they have almost 100%, and that's not the wrong. We also have Luxembourg having close to 100% of its people being literate. We also have Norway, we have Finland. And remember what I said about statistics, empirical evidence, that there exists a negative relationship between your literacy rate and level of poverty. So definitely the level of poverty, if you look at it, will be very low in these communities around the world. So let's consider the counterparts. The countries with the lowest literacy rate around the world. I looked at Mali, 31%, Chad between 27% and 38%. We have Ethiopia at 39% literacy rate, and Nigeria at 51% literacy rate. Remember, I said the first point, the check for development, is that it must be people oriented. Let's consider another aspect of the people that you should also look at as the government of any nation if we are serious about development of your country. We are going to look at the life expectancy ratio. So according to World Population Review, life expectancy ratio in Monaco is 87, and that is the highest around the globe. That means locals live up to an average age of 87 years in Monaco. We also have Hungary at 85. Locals live up to an average of 85 years. We have Macau, 85 as well, and also Japan, 84. I know that some economists will have argued that it means that government will be paying so much in terms of pension, but it has a lot of advantages, a lot of merits when people live up to that. Look at the social benefits of having old people, in your country. You can pass on values, experience to the next generation, and it has immense benefit to a nation. So, likewise, let's consider countries with the lowest life expectancy ratio. We have Chad, they live up to the average expectancy ratio is 54. We have Nigeria also 54, and we have Lesotho 55 years. So we are saying the life expectancy ratio where the locals can live up to an average is 54 years in Nigeria, 54 in Chad, and 55 years old in Lesotho. So we cannot continue to ask ourselves these issues of development, because we said development must be people-oriented, and when you are breaking it down, you are looking at the standard of living, their literacy rate, life expectancy ratio, even mortality rate. These and many more are factors that you consider on that, economic development. The second criteria or check for development that I would move on to is that development must create the capacity for the people to be self-reliant. You must create that capacity. And if you look at the first point I mentioned, when the literacy rate is high, when you are educated, you expect a level of exposure. It goes with self-discovery as an individual. It goes with you building institution, infrastructure for your people. It goes, it speaks to all of these structures that will be in place. So even when I discover myself, that structures, even financial structures in terms of loan, that will back me up, to move my ideas from mere conceptualization to implementation stage, to reality. Self-reliance. If I have low self-esteem as an individual, there's no way I'm going to think of, believing in myself, let alone being self-reliant. So it speaks again to self-esteem. So the third check is that it has to be a long-term process. Economic development is not going to be a one-off process. It's going to be a long-term process. So if I've attained economic development at a particular point in time, are we saying that it's going to be one-off? What happens to the next generation? What happens to the next generation? What happens to the future generations? That's why even nations has moved beyond just talking about economic development to moving into the concept of sustainable development. Because even when you are experiencing development, there is a need to review the type of economic development taking place periodically to ensure that the process, the gains and fruits from this development are not environmentally destructive. If they are environmentally destructive, then you are going to be hindering the economic development, the gains of future generations. That is, present development must not. Present development, the gains from present economic development must not compromise the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. That is why we talk about the concept of sustainable development. That is, development that meets the needs of the present generation without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. The fourth criteria is that development cannot be abstract. It must be observable and measurable. How do you measure development? We have talked about the indices. We'll still talk about the main measures of economic development. But you can look at it, look at the standard of the living of the people. You are looking at the literacy rate of your people, the mortality rate, life expectancy rate, the human development index, HDI, among other factors. You must be able to measure. It's tangible. You must be able to feel it. You must be able to observe. When you observe and you measure, then you can monitor, because what you do not monitor, you do not observe and measure, you cannot improve. And because recall that economic development is a long-term process. And there are many beliefs about economic development. For some people, the notion is that economic development should be purely the concern and the responsibility of the national or level. So the focus should be on the national level. That is the argument provided by some people, that it should not be national level, it should end there. Everything should start and end with them. No, in reality, he said that why the national level will look at the macroeconomic policies, look at the regulating framework that would important to set the pace for growth and economic development in a nation. However, we also the local, the regional institutions, even the state level, also have their role to play, in achieving economic development in a nation. So it's not just the responsibility of the national level to do all. Yes, they will set the macroeconomic policies, but also those closer to the people also have their responsibilities to play in ensuring that their people feel the gains of economic development in the nation. Some could even ask, are there any economic benefits in investing in the quality of life of the people? Yes. Economic development takes various forms. The interesting fact is that one is not always sure about which of the projects that you have deployed, that you have carried out in an economy, in a nation, at a particular point in time, we have the highest benefits. You are not sure of which of these economic development programs that you have deployed would have the highest impact. That's the fact about economic development. However, anything that you do right now, in the short run, you might not have that kind of benefit, it may not accrue to you the way it was, but in the long run, it's going to have far-reaching impacts. So let's take this example. In 2016, a report was submitted to the then President Obama, the president then of the United States. He cited early childhood education as a crucial factor needed for economic stability. You could ask, how does something like early childhood education, how does it improve or let alone stabilize an economy? Remember what I said? It was a report that was submitted in 2016, early childhood education, and the pointer was that it has a positive relationship with economic stability. But you could ask, what relevance does this have? Okay, but let's see how. Recent reports project that in the United States, as many as 2 million manufacturing jobs will go unfulfilled by 2025. Why? It's just because the youth, the children are gradually graduating into the workforce without the required skill set needed to fill the available jobs. So you can see when the report came in that, look, early childhood education was important for for economic stability, and you look, ordinarily a lay person will not see the connection. But the report came years after to say that there's a projection that by 2025, by next year, 2 million manufacturing jobs will go unfulfilled. So that gap, that loop is where economic development reforms comes in. So the reality is that economic development might not have a distinct impact in the short run, but will provide meaningful solutions to a widespread problem, because and this will help to improve the quality of life if it's handled. So it's a long-term process. It has to be futuristic. You have to think beyond the now. You are projecting future development, future needs, and you are tackling it out from the upfront. Naturally, you expect that a country that is experiencing economic growth would actually translate into economic development in such a country. But in reality, realize that it's not always the same. Sometimes you can have economic growth without gains, economic growth not leading to development. Is there any empirical evidence to back this up? Yes, I looked at the work of Salom Eka et al. And there was this investigation that was carried out by this team where they looked at countries where economic growth has not effectively translated into poverty reduction, even still polluting the environment. It was discovered. They found that a third of 160 countries analyzed had a surge in extreme poverty, despite expanding the economic growth post-pandemic period. And in the one interesting part also came out from their study that Sub-Saharan Africa is the most affected region, with an average of 130,000 individuals per country moving into extreme poverty per percentage point of GDP growth each year. So let's investigate. What are those reasons? What are those factors responsible for you having economic growth without development? So the first reason why a country can experience growth without necessarily experiencing development is when the population growth rate in that country is higher than the GDP growth rate. Yes, you are producing, you have increased in terms of what you have produced as a nation. However, your population growth rate has, doubled. That means your GDP is growing at an arithmetic progression, but your population growth rate is growing at a geometric progression. So if you are growing, if your population is expanding, you should leverage on that to produce more. If your population strength as number in terms of numbers has increased from maybe a 15 million population to a 25 million, that should translate into higher output. Your people should produce more. They should be enabled to produce more in terms of tangible goods, in terms of services rendered. That is when your economic growth can lead to development. But if you are growing, you are producing, but your growth rate is higher than your GDP growth rate, it means you are not productive. It can lead to development. Because remember when I spoke about per capita income on a maiden edition, I said that whatever it is you produce as a nation will be divided by the population of that nation. So we expect that the more populous countries should produce more. It's when you produce more, then you can talk about experiencing economic growth with economic development. Let's look at the second reason why growth might not lead to the development is when you have sectorial imbalance. When you have sectorial imbalance in development, it's not going to lead to that. What do I mean by this? Economic growth would only lead to economic development when progress is experienced in all or almost all sectors of the economy. There are various sectors in an economy. We have the agriculture, we have the mining, petroleum, energy, we have the education, we have the transportation sector, we have the communication, we have different, sectors in a particular economy. So if what you're just experiencing is over dependence on one sector, so for instance, if all the growth you're experiencing is just from your petroleum or the energy sector, and you have neglected other sectors in terms of the agricultural sector, your education, your mining, so what is happening is that your growth will not be balanced. It can lead to development. Development, growth must be comprehensive. It must be balanced. It must cover all sectors. Yes, am I saying that all the sectors will grow at the same pace? Definitely no. But the disparity must not be huge. So if your petroleum sector, your energy sector has grown, by 50% or 65.2%, you expect the agricultural sector should still grow. That means it's going to be productive. It must also grow to like a 58 or a 58.5%. You also expect that the educational sector should also grow. It is when all these sectors are growing, if not at the same pace, but close to one another, that is when true development can take place. When you look around, that's why in developing countries, we have what we call the Dutch disease. And this is something we'll be speaking so much about. That why is it that those that are naturally blessed are not among the top developed nations of the world? Why do we have a lot of developing nations endowed with natural resources, and we see at the ING world, to them they are still developing? So it means the third disease is saying are those natural resources, will you tell them to be a curse or do you tell them to be a blessing? So in reality, when you have those natural resources, you must not have over dependence on a particular sector. All your sectors must be fully, developed. They must grow. That is when you can experience true economic development as a nation. So when you see a particular sector growing in a country, it is not going to automatically translate to development. So if you are wondering, yes, the GDP has grown by a particular percentage, what you should be asking yourself for going forward is what the population growth rate is. What it is much higher. Is it way higher than the GDP growth rate? You're going to be asking yourself, this increase in terms of the GDP of a nation, okay, what sector is it coming from? Are all the sectors in the country? Are they fully developed? Are they growing at the same pace or almost at the same pace? Is there any sector that has been neglected? So this is another crucial factor why economic growth would not automatically translate into economic development in a nation. Let's consider another factor, the third one, income inequalities. That is very important. One of the macroeconomic objectives of a nation is that you want to ensure equitable distribution of income. You want to reduce the gap between the rich and the poor. You want to streamline, though you can't eradicate completely the gap between the rich and the poor, you want to streamline it, you want to bridge that gap. That's why you come up with a lot of policies, you come up with taxes, the pay as you earn strategy, that the higher you earn, the higher your taxes levied on you. Okay, so it's all of these strategies to reduce income inequality. So if a huge gap exist between the rich and the poor in a nation, you do not allow a nation to reap the benefits of economic growth, because in reality those benefits would only be enjoyed by the few that are rich. So in such a nation, if the disparity is very high, you can't be talking about economic development. In fact, you realize that in developing nations, we have what we call the high income earners, the low income earners, and the middle income earners. Realize that middle income earners, that gap is really thinning out. It's getting slimmer. It's getting slimmer every day, because the inflationary pressure would affect the middle class. There are factors that are mitigating, against that, the expansion of the middle class. That gap between those that are extremely rich and those that are extremely poor. The middle class is getting smaller, reducing. Even in some countries, it's almost as if we have just less than 2% of the population that fall within this. So when you have that kind of huge disparity between the rich and the poor, definitely you would experience growth in terms of increase in goods and services, but not true development, because development speaks to the quality of life of the people, and that goes back to the standard of living of your citizens in a nation. Let's consider the fourth reason, that is moral decadence and religious fanaticism. Impressive growth in an economy is nothing without sound moral values. You can't take it away. Some will talk about other factors, political factors, economic factors, different dimensions to it. But moral decadence, as simple as it sounds, religious fanaticism are very strong factors, inhibiting economic development in a nation. Because once you do not hold high value in a country, the level of corruption will be high, crime rate will be high. Talk about issue of misery, depression, kidnapping, and all sorts. So definitely this is going to hinder the level of development of a nation. If I don't feel secured and I want to come with my funds, you can't be talking about foreign direct investment, wanting to woo investors into your country, and you have high level of corruption, embedded in your system, and strength in your institutions. Is going to affect, such a nation from experiencing true development. As simple as you think that must sound, these are very crucial, issues that should be looked at in every community, every society. Well, I really could go on and on, but I want to draw the curtain here. Thank you so much for joining us today. I hope that you join us same time, same station next Friday. I remain yours, Titala Ogushono, and I wish you all a great weekend. Bye from here.